The movie begins with an old man in a retirement center named Paul Edgecombe, waking up from an unpleasant dream. He takes 2 pieces of dry toast from an attendant at the old age home, who mentions Paul's habit of taking long walks outside the ground. The attendant is worried about Paul, but allows him to continue with his daily routine. Paul and several other residents are watching TV when an old movie with Fred Astaire dancing to the song Heaven is playing on TV. Paul sees it and is suddenly overcome by emotion, so he walks away, followed by his friend Elaine. Elaine realizes that the movie has awakened some powerful memories in Paul and asks about it. Paul tells Elaine his story. He was a prison guard during the Depression, in charge of death row, informally called the Green Mile, because of its green tile floor. Paul's most powerful memory of this time took place in 1935. The story then flashes back to the 1930s at the Louisiana State Prison, where a young Paul Edgecombe suffers from a urinary infection. Some of the other guards, Brutus Howell, Dean Stanton, Harry Terwilliger, and Percy Wetmore, bring in a new inmate. Percy makes quite a spectacle out of the arrival, repeatedly yelling, "Dead man walking through the complex," much to the annoyance of the other guards. The convict's name is John Coffey. John is a gigantic, muscular man. But when Paul talks to John, they find that he has the mindset of a small child, very gentle and apparently scared of the dark. After John has been placed inside his cell, he mysteriously states that he tried to take it back, but it was too late. Paul confronts Percy for his constantly annoying and instigating behavior. But when Percy shows nothing but disrespect for authority, Paul dismisses him from the mile to go work elsewhere. Percy is not happy about this, and in frustration, he lashes out at another inmate named Edouard Delacroix and breaks Del's fingers. Paul is given a copy of John Coffey's records and finds that he was sent to death row after being convicted for the murder of 2 small girls. After the 2 girls went missing, the crowd went looking for them, and they found John sitting in an open field, crying uncontrollably while holding the dead girls in his arms. As he was arrested, John stated that he tried to take it back, but it was too late. Later on, Paul is outside when he is met by Warden Hal Moores. Hal gives Paul the execution papers for an inmate named Arlen Bitterbuck and has a conversation with him about Percy. It's revealed that Percy is the nephew of the governor's wife, and his powerful political connections are what got him hired and keep him in the job, because Percy is apparently stupid and mean, according to the other guards. Paul finds out that they have already received a complaint about Percy being removed from the Green Mile, even though he broke an inmate's fingers. However, Hal has also learned that Percy has applied for an administrator job at a mental hospital, which would mean better pay and better hours, and no more Percy on the mile. Paul gets to know that Percy wants to witness an execution up close before moving on to a new job. Warden Hal Moores also mentions that his wife, Melinda, is not well. She suffers from bad headaches and is scheduled for an X-ray in order to find the source of the problem. That night, Paul talks about John Coffey and his concerns for Melinda with his wife January. He also regrets that they cannot make love as long as he has his infection, but disregards her advice to see a doctor for it. Next day, Brutus spots a mouse in the cell block. They watch it run into a small room in the corner, which turns out to be a padded room for dangerous inmates, but is currently used for storage. The guards check everything in the room, but do not find the mouse. A few hours later, Percy arrives, spots the mouse, and goes into a fury trying to kill it. The mouse goes back into the padded room, and Percy intends to go in. The other guards purposely don't tell him that they already tried that, and watch in amusement as Percy unpacks the entire room again, all in vain. Afterwards, Paul complains to Percy for scaring the inmates in his pursuit of the mouse. Percy doesn't care, thinking the inmates are detestable. Paul feels differently, believing that the inmates are under enough stress since they are waiting to die. If put under more strain, they could snap and cause serious problems. After more of Percy's offensive behavior, Brutus grabs him, but Percy threatens to use his connections as nephew to the governor's wife to get the others fired if they hurt him. Paul retorts that if he ever makes such a threat again, they will harm him, even at the cost of their jobs. While Bitterbuck is granted one final meeting with his family, Paul and the others prepare the auditorium with the electric chair for his upcoming execution. They do a repetition with the prison's elderly janitor, Toot Toot, helping them. Paul instructs Percy to watch and learn while the others prep the electric chair. One of the guards explains to Percy the necessity of putting a wet sponge on the convict's head before the cap with the electrodes is attached. This will cause the electric current to go straight through the head and allow the execution to go more smoothly. That night, Bitterbuck is prepared for the execution. In his final talk with Paul, he recalls his most pleasant memory and asks Paul if he believes that if a man repents for his crimes, that he will go back to the time that he was most happy. Paul says he believes that exact thing. Brutus leads Bitterbuck's execution, which is carried out with little problems. Afterwards, Paul confronts Percy with his new job opportunity, stimulating him to take it now that he has witnessed an execution. However, Percy reveals that he wants to be placed in charge of an inmate's execution before he leaves the next day. The inmate named Dell has found the mouse again and named it Mr. Jingles and is trying to tame it. The other guards allow Dell to keep Mr. Jingles as a pet. Even Percy is unexpectedly supportive of this, suggesting they get the mouse a cigar box to sleep in. Paul meets with Warden Hal again, getting word of a new inmate coming in, a man named William Wharton, also called Wild Bill, who had killed 3 people in a holdup. Hal is almost in tears. The doctors have told him that his wife Melinda has a tumor that is the size of a lemon in her brain. The tumor is inoperable and will eventually be the reason for his wife's death. That night, Paul suffers from his urinary infection even more. He is in constant pain. He intends to see the doctor the next day after the new inmate has been brought in. Percy and Harry go to bring back Wharton from the mental hospital, where he is in an apparent trance, probably from medication. As soon as Wharton enters the mile, he springs to life, clearly having faked his drug-induced stupor. He attacks the unsuspecting guards and incapacitates Paul by kneeing him in the abdomen. Dean is nearly strangled, and Percy is nailed to the floor in shock, unable to take any action despite Paul's cries for help. Finally, Brutus comes in and takes Wharton out. Paul urges the others to go and report what has happened and stop by the medical facility, while he will handle everything at the mile. As soon as the others have left, he collapses in pain. John Coffey then asks to speak with Paul. With great effort, Paul approaches John's cell, but John grabs Paul and puts his hand over Paul's abdomen. John holds on for several seconds until the light shines brightly. John then lets go, coughing and gasping until he releases a cloud of small winged insects from his mouth that disappear in the air. Paul asks what happened, but John can only say, "I helped." He becomes tired and goes to sleep. Later, when Paul visits the washroom, he feels no pain at all. John Coffey's act has healed his infection. Paul comes home and feels completely reborn, making love to his wife almost all night. The next day, Paul presents John with a loaf of cornbread baked by his wife, as a thanks for John's help. John shares the cornbread with Dell and Mr. Jingles. Dell's execution is coming nearer, and the guards are having a talk with him about it. Dell's main concern is what will happen to Mr. Jingles. Brutus suggests sending him off to a magical place called Mouseville in Florida. But first, they feel that Dell should do a show with Mr. Jingles for the prison staff. The preparation for Dell's execution takes place the next day, as Dell performs his show with Mr. Jingles. Paul has decided to put Percy in charge, in the hope that he will finally leave the prison immediately afterward Dell's execution. Dell's show is a big success, and Percy's rehearsal for Dell's execution went well too, so both men seem to be on good terms for a change. However, in a momentary lapse of concentration, Percy walks too close to the cells and is grabbed through the bars by Wharton. Wharton threatens Percy for a while before letting him go. Ashamed of being unresponsive while under attack, Percy threatens the guards to never mention this to anyone. Paul states that what happens on the mile stays on the mile and promises to not say anything about what happened to anyone. Later on, Mr. Jingles runs across the room between cells. Percy walks up and stomps on the mouse, leaving Dell screaming in agony. John asks for the mouse, so Paul picks it up and hands it to John. The other guards watch in shock and possibly horror as light shines from John's hands. John coughs, releases another cloud of insects, and Mr. Jingles runs across the room, as good as new. Percy, seeing that the mouse is uninjured, is furious, thinking the guards have set out to make a fool out of him. Paul confronts Percy and gives him an ultimatum to transfer out of the mile immediately after Dell's execution, or the others will go public about Percy's record of abuse of the prisoners and his inadequate behavior on the mile. Percy agrees. The night of Dell's execution has arrived. Just before he walks through the mile to the electric chair, Dell gives Mr. Jingles to Paul, knowing that he will be taken care of. When Paul points out that he cannot have a mouse sitting on his shoulder during an execution, John volunteers to take care of Mr. Jingles. Dell is placed on the chair in front of the audience as Percy starts the ceremony. As his last lines, an emotional Dell asks for forgiveness for his crimes and asks Paul not to forget about Mouseville. Percy proceeds by hooking Dell up to the electrodes. With one small exception, he purposely does not soak the sponge he places on Dell's head, wanting to punish Dell one more time. Paul notices that the sponge is dry, but it is too late as the electricity has already been activated. As a result, the execution is excruciatingly painful for Delaware. As a result, Dell convulses and screams in pain, much to the increasing horror of the audience. At the same time, John is hysterically crying as he seems to telepathically feel Dell's struggle. Paul and the other guards watch with fear, but don't dare turn off the electricity, thinking that it will not take much longer. The horrified audience starts to panic and flees the scene, despite Hal Moore's assurance that everything is okay. Paul notices that Percy is averting his eyes, but forces him to watch until Dell finally dies. Brutus orders him to put out the fire with an extinguisher. Afterwards, Percy claims he didn't know that the sponge needed to be wet, upon which Brutus violently punches him. Paul holds Brutus, saying what's done is done, and Percy isn't worth fighting over. Hal comes in and angrily demands to know what went wrong. Paul blames Percy's inexperience for the disastrous execution, but adds that Percy was about to accept his new job at the mental institution anyway, cleverly forcing him to honor their agreement. Paul and his wife go to visit Hal and Melinda the next day. Melinda seems pretty well, but Hal reveals that she is rapidly falling apart. She is losing her memory and experiencing severe behavioral changes, including uncontrollable cursing. Paul decides to invite the other guards to dinner later and discusses John's acts of healing both him and Mr. Jingles. Paul states that he can no longer watch what is happening to Melinda, so he wants to sneak John out of the prison to try and heal her. The others are very skeptical, pointing out that John is a convicted murderer, and it would be disastrous if they would be discovered, or if he escapes. Paul puts forth his belief that John is innocent. He does not see God putting a gift like that in the hands of a man who would kill a child. The other guards agree to help, thinking it is worth the risk. The next day, they carry out the plan. Paul brings some drinks and offers the drink that has been spiked to Wharton, which puts him to sleep. The others then gag Percy, put him in the straitjacket, and place him in the padded room for a few hours, supposedly as retribution for what he did to Dell, but in reality it is so that he will not see them leaving. They open up John's cell, and he is excited at the prospect of going for a ride outside and to help Melinda. However, on their way out, Wharton, not entirely out cold yet, grabs John's arm. John is apparently horrified by what he sees when touching Wharton. Wharton finally falls asleep. They arrive at Hal's home, and Hal threatens them with a shotgun, thinking there is a prison riot or escape attempt going on. Paul tactfully talks him down, while John goes upstairs to meet Melinda. John gets very close to Melinda's face, and something comes out of her mouth and into his, making the light in the room shine intensely, even causing a small earthquake. John breaks the connection with her and falls down coughing. Melinda sits up, looking much healthier and having no memory of anything that happened before her X-ray. Hal collapses, crying at his wife's restoration. John continues to cough, unable to release the insects like before. Melinda gives John a pendant with the mark of Saint Christopher the Healer as a present. The men return to the prison, and John is still very ill from the encounter. Dean mentions that Wharton has almost regained consciousness. Percy is released from the isolation cell and looks extremely angry. As Percy leaves, John grabs him through the bars, holds his face close to his, releases the insects directly into Percy's mouth, and lets go of him. Percy, in a daze, walks over to Wharton's cell. Wharton is just coming to taunt him some more. Percy, with a tear running across his face, empties his revolver into Wharton's chest. Others see Percy lean back and cough up the remaining black insects. Paul asks John why he did this. John states that Wharton and Percy were bad men, and he punished them for it. He tells Paul that he needs to see for himself and sticks out his hand. Ignoring the protests of the other guards, Paul takes John's hand and immediately starts seeing the memories of Wharton that John is carrying. Wharton was a worker on the farm where the two little girls lived. One night, he snuck into their room and abducted them. He threatened them that if one would scream, he would kill the other. Paul sees that Wharton was responsible for the double murder that John was convicted for. After finally letting go, John tells a devastated Paul that Wharton killed the girls with their love for each other. Hal and the police arrive at the mile, where Percy, upon examination, appears to be schizophrenic. Percy is taken away and sent to a mental hospital, ironically the same place where he was supposed to be an administrator. Now that he knows John is innocent, Paul is unsure how to proceed. He talks to his wife that night, and she suggests talking to John to see what he wants. The next day, Paul and the others have a talk with John. They ask him if they should just let him go. John does not want to escape, as he doesn't want to get them in trouble. With regards to the upcoming execution, Paul asks John how he could ever justify killing an innocent man before God. John tells him not to worry. He reveals that in addition to healing, he can also feel the pain of all others around him. He does not wish to continue with such pain and darkness in the world, so the execution would be an act of kindness, even if it's for a crime he did not commit. Paul offers John a last request. John states that he has always wanted to see a flicker show, a motion picture. They bring in a movie projector with the film Top Hat, the same movie that the elderly Paul was watching at the beginning of the movie, which is what triggered Paul's memories. Particularly when Fred Astaire is dancing to the song Heaven. John watches in awe, saying that the movie actors were just like angels in heaven. The day of John's execution finally arrives. Paul has to take John's pendant, but promises to return it to him after his death. The guards take John to the auditorium, where John senses immense hostility from the audience, where the dead girl's parents openly criticize and mock him. Brutus tells John to focus on the feelings of the guards, who have nothing but sympathy for him. John is strapped to the chair as the guards watch on in tears. As per John's tearful request, Paul does not put a hood over his face, as he is still scared of the dark. Before giving the order to switch on the electric button, Paul steps up and shakes John's hand. Again, he hears John's voice saying he killed them with their love. As the electric switch is turned on, the execution goes smoothly and John dies. Afterwards, Paul puts the pendant back on his neck. The elderly Paul's voice cuts in and states that he and Brutus left the Green Mile soon after, unable to carry on after seeing John die. They were transferred to a youth corrections facility. Elaine admits that Paul's tale is quite a story, but she does not completely believe it. She points out that something does not add up. Paul mentioned his son being grown up in 1935, which means he should be much older than he appears. Paul takes Elaine on a walk, and they come to a cabin in the woods. There is a mouse sleeping in a small box. Elaine is shocked to meet Mr. Jingles. We see a flashback to Paul returning to the Miles shortly after John's execution. He finds the mouse again, and has kept him ever since. Old Paul states that he is now 108 years old, and that he believes John Coffey infected him and Mr. Jingles with life. Paul feels that this is his punishment for killing a genuine miracle of God. He must stay alive and watch everyone he cares for die before his own death. Later, Paul is seen at Elaine's funeral, quietly wondering just how much longer he has to go on. He has no doubt in his mind that he will die one day. But if God can extend the life of a mouse for so many years, how long does he need to go on living?